All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is the February session of the Society of Agricultural Communications Scholars webinar. This afternoon, we have Kisto Settle, who'll be facilitating a discussion with a title of Things That Get Your Manuscript Rejected. So he has a good panel to talk about some of the things that they have noticed, and hopefully will be able to provide us with some ideas about things that will get our manuscript accepted. After the panel discussion, we'll have a little bit of time at the end as normal. And if you have any announcements or things you'd like to share, that would be great. Usually I allow the presenter and the panelists to determine if you would like to have questions in the process or at the end. That's really all I have as far as an introduction. Keista, I'm going to turn it over to you and to your panel.
All right, so we are missing one panelist. Dr. Baker wasn't able to make it, but she did give some feedback so that some of her input could be there as well. So we're going to do a panel. I've got about three kind of core questions I want to start with, and I've got some other questions that I'll ask if y'all don't have questions, but because this is a panel, I want to make sure y'all get to ask them your questions. So first, I would like the panelists to just go ahead and just introduce themselves and talk about their experiences just in general about being a reviewer and overseeing the review process. So I'm going to go left to right on my screen. So Dr. Myers, if you wouldn't mind beginning.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by acknowledging that anytime I have a paper rejected, I blame Kisto. I figure he's the reviewer. And when I read the comments, I just imagine his voice. Sorry, Kisto. Had to get that one out there. So I have served as on the editorial team for the Journal of Applied Communications. So I've seen it from that perspective. I have also been in charge of the Triple AE poster review submission site. So I've seen it from that perspective as well. And then I'll say that my life as a reviewer is never ending. I think I have at least 12 things currently in my inbox that are requests for review. NACTA manuscripts or abstracts just went out. I have, in the past month reviewed for 3 different journals. So I think that there's, it just is a never ending commitment to service in the profession. So while this, I'm glad that Ricky mentioned that while the name of this is about things that get your manuscript rejected, we also want to acknowledge that there are things that you can do to improve the odds of it being accepted. And I want to give a general call out to say that your work as a reviewer is important and we need it. So with that, I'll let Kisto pass it to the next panelist.
All right, Dr. Ruth.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I am currently the past president for the National Agricultural Communications Symposium. So I got to oversee our poster review process this past year and the paper review process the year before. Similar to Dr. Myers, I always assumed that kind of angry reviewer was Kisto until I got to see some of the reviewers and see his comments, and he's actually not that angry of a reviewer, I will say that. I hope that's not like divulging too much, but I've also been rejected from a lot of places and can kind of tell you my experience with that too. And similar to Dr. Myers, I feel like I have so many reviews right now and I'm constantly trying to catch up on those, and it's just part of the process. But it's been really interesting to see what the review process looks like within our discipline for journals like JAC or JE versus outside of our discipline too, because they do look for different things and that process is set up a little bit different. And hopefully we have time to chat about that today too. But when he first invited me to be on this panel, I said, this feels like a trap with that title of why reviewers reject. But I think this will be a good discussion overall.
And Dr. Specht. Oh, Annie. Can you hear me? And if y'all want, just use a blanket. You can always blame me. I got blamed in our college's curriculum committee recently on something that I had nothing to do with. I'm a good scapegoat. It's the bald head. Looks like Annie's having some issues with. So while she's doing that, I guess I want to jump into most common reasons for rejections. And Courtney, if you wouldn't mind, talk about like desk rejects, especially for Jack. Like, what's the things that lead to desk rejects for Jack?
Well, and I'll answer that and stall long enough, hopefully, for Annie to chime in from her perspective. So when I was in that role with the journal, one of the first things that was easiest for me to desk reject is if the author didn't follow the formatting guidelines. And somebody might say to you, well, that's not that big of a deal. Well, if they didn't even read what, like, double spaced with line numbers and headings, then I have to assume that the rest of the document was put together with as much care. And so I would scan the document and see that, yeah, they're just pushing this out to whatever they think that they could get it to land. So I would quickly desk reject those. And I feel like as an author, you have some control over that, like, following the formatting guidelines. The other thing that I would often desk reject is if it was obviously not a good fit. Like if it was a real strong economic analysis paper, I would say this isn't going to fit well with our readers. Most often my line, and I'm sure Annie would agree with me, my line was, I don't have anybody in my reviewer pool with the expertise to give this a solid review. Therefore, we're not going to accept it. A lot of times you can avoid that, and this will be my last point, and hopefully Annie's mic is working now. You can avoid that by reaching out to the editor in advance to say, I have this idea for a project or for a paper. This is the purpose and the research questions. Would this be an appropriate fit for your journal? And I had several people do that before they submitted, and I was able to say, well, based on that, here's what I would emphasize, or if you could explain the applied nature of this, then it was a better fit. So those are just a couple quick things I noted. Fingers crossed Annie's mic works now.
I think it's working. Sorry. I'm working from home today. My sister's in the hospital. She's in labor today. So I'm going to become an aunt, and I'm getting family text messages, which means my AirPods are like bouncing between multiple devices at this point, but I am here. So thanks for that time fill, Courtney. I guess, Kisto, I'll go ahead and introduce myself and do the spiel. All right, so I am Annie Specht. I'm an associate professor at Ohio State, and I am currently finishing up my tenure on the Journal of Applied Communications editorial team. So I served as the managing editor, the executive editor last year, and then this year I'm serving as the past editor. So I've also reviewed and been an officer for the National AgCom Symposium. So like Taylor, I have had the experience of helping lead, reviews and issuing acceptances for that conference. And then I've reviewed for any number of journals and conferences at this point. So like the rest of the panelists, I think the list continues to grow, which is great because we are definitely seeing more, a broader application of our AgCom research to a lot of different places that we didn't traditionally try to publish, which, the more places we can share our research, I think the better. But Kisto, do you want me to share information about desk rejects, or do you want to kick off another question?
Especially because you would have seen what they would look like more recently over the past 3 years.
Yeah, so I can echo a lot of what Courtney shared. Formatting is a big one. Page counts, we get a lot of manuscripts that are, well over the page limit, which is a pretty generous page limit for Jack. And I think a lot of that cursory kind of desk review has a lot to do with, as Courtney said, making sure that there are reviewers available and hopefully willing to review that paper. And if someone turns in a 35-page manuscript, no one's going to want to read that, and we understand that. And so making sure that they're following page counts, following formatting guidelines, and then also just making sure that the manuscript is a good fit for the journal. We get a lot of research. Because the journal description has a lot of information about technology in it specifically. One of the things that I noticed in my couple of years working with reviewers and working with authors was that any application of technology, even if it was something like geospatial technology, they would submit it to Jack without inquiring first if it was a good fit. And I would have to go back and say, this is not the area of expertise for anyone in our reviewer pool, and chances are you're not going to be lucky in that. And so one of the things that I would often try to do is do a little Googling and say, well, here's this journal that you might consider submitting to, or if it might fit into another disciplinary journal within ag ed broadly, sending them, giving them enough of a, of enough grace to at least say, here's a place where you might consider sending this, even if Jack is not quite the right fit. So those are the big things.
And so this one will shift to all three of y'all. But what are going to be the most common reasons that you start to see rejections that actually make it all the way to review? So whether it's it was reviewed but outright rejected, or it was reviewed but becomes a revised resubmit. And I'll pick on Taylor if you want to start, since you haven't gotten to talk yet.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit from the conference side. And I do think from what I've seen and experienced, conference reviewers do look at those papers a little bit differently than they do for journal. And I think the threshold for acceptance looks a little bit different, because some of them say there's merit here to present and discuss this, but there's things to consider before it goes to journal. Those types of comments are pretty common. For like it to be outright rejected, I think the most common thing that I've seen is just clarity of methods. So if the reviewer isn't able to basically understand pretty much every piece of those methods, that is when it's rejected. So I was kind of skimming through the ones from the past few years, and if it wasn't clear what questions were asked, how the data were analyzed, how reliability and validity were established, if there wasn't clear justification or connection of like who was actually in the sample and how that connected to the purpose of that research, that's what led to rejection. So needing to expand more on the literature review, expand more on the methods discussion, those kind of led to accept as posters. But if the methods were unclear, that's what really led to rejection. Similarly, though, too, if things just need to be expanded, that was okay. But if there weren't super clear connections between the theoretical framework and what was collected in the discussion, those papers were often discussed too. And similar to what Annie and Courtney are talking about with formatting going to journal, same thing with formatting for conference as well, especially with APA. I do know, I've talked to several different faculty who said when they review, some of them will go straight to the reference list. And if there's just riddled with APA errors, they will just reject it. They won't review it, because in their eyes, if the person submitting didn't take the time to check that, I'm not going to take the time to review this. So that's really critical, especially if you are working with grad students or undergrad students, like at least get the APA right, because some reviewers won't even look at the content if that isn't in line too. So those are some of the things that I've seen with conference papers, but it usually has to be pretty extreme, or a pretty extreme, like not a great fit or not a great justification for it to be outright rejected. Otherwise, for the most part, it's at least considered for a like poster presentation.
I'll jump in. There was one thing as you were talking, I made a note. One thing that if there was no connection to the discipline or to other published works within the journal that were obviously relevant, that was usually something. I mean, chances are in our SMART discipline, you forgot to cite the reviewer and you have to be careful about how, the reviewer would have to be careful, but they'd have to say, like, hey, check out Ruth 2023. You might find some relevant connections here. But I reviewed one recently for another journal and they didn't cite anything. And I went to the journal and just typed in some keywords. And I'm like, just a quick search of this journal led me to find 4 or 5 other relevant papers that you could help expand on or connect to. So again, and I did end up rejecting that article. And we can talk about other reasons I noted. But that's one bullet point I wanted to add to Taylor's comments.
And I can piggyback off of the concept of, the conference. A lot of conferences have shifted from outright rejecting a full manuscript to allowing it to be presented as a poster. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do on the journal side is kind of follow that same mindset a little bit. So the Journal of Applied Communications has a category of submissions called Research in Brief, which is really, really similar in concept to a poster presentation. And so we're seeing increasingly folks who are submitting material that might not be super robust, whether it's methodologically or theoretically, but there's still merit and there's still possibility for, especially some of our professional readers, to glean something important from that research. And so the Research in Brief category gives reviewers a chance to say, well, I'm going to reject this as a full manuscript because it doesn't have that it factor that really represents a full publication. But at the same time, having an opportunity to still share that information with readers is really important. Here's a thought about submitting this as more of a kind of, it's sort of along the lines of a poster of a professional development piece, but giving readers an opportunity to interact with some of that research without it being a full 20-page manuscript. So we are trying to kind of follow that same pattern to give some of those, especially early career faculty or graduate students who are doing good but not maybe like great research, still giving them an outlet to publish where they can share their work.
And so we've kind of touched on fit. We talked about fit for JAC. We've talked about fit for these categories. Could you also share your experiences as authors of navigating that fit process as you've published outside of JAC? Like, what advice would you give folks as they're trying to go beyond just our small little bubble of ag communications?
I know I've had some trouble in the past trying to publish some of my state-focused research in some of these outside journals or journals with a higher impact factor, because they are looking for a broader implication unless you can strongly justify why it's in that state. Like if you're looking at a commodity that's very specific to that state, or if you're looking at a natural disaster within that state, like that might make sense. But if you're looking broadly at perceptions of a food product, we tried to submit some to some of these journals and they're just like, this just isn't, it's too narrow of a scope. So then I knew when we were setting up future studies, we broadened it to regional studies or collected a national panel. And that was much more easier to get into those outlets. But I'm sure there's other factors too. But I think we have to really consider that even when we're designing our studies or we're submitting our grants, because so often it makes sense. We're trying to focus within our state, within our local area. But when we're trying to submit to the journals outside of our immediate discipline, in my experience at least, those have not been as successful getting published due to that limited population versus those regional or national studies that I've done instead. So I think it's important to look at those and see what types of articles are being published. And like I said, even going back to when you're submitting the grant or you're setting up that study, think about where you want it to go and how that sample might limit those opportunities too.
I don't know if Annie has anything. Honestly, I'll be frank, I don't submit to those journals. It's hard to get things published when I know they're good and relevant for my discipline. So I commend people who look beyond our discipline, and I'm fully tenured and promoted, so I'm lucky I don't have to play that rat race that some of you obviously will need to pay attention to. And so Taylor's comments are really important to understand. But in my department, what matters is publications. And over time, the impact factors and the H whatevers, all of that's going to become more relevant. And so I really appreciate her perspective of designing your studies with those publications in mind of what you want to shoot for. But at the end of the day, I think my biggest regret is not following up on papers that got rejected. Not my biggest regret. I mean, come on, I've lived a life, but I regret not following through on those papers that were rejected, and saying, well, they weren't a good fit for that audience, but let's see where they do fit. And those of you who are doing that, I would commend you for that persistence, because that's what it takes to really have a good publishing track record. So I would say that everyone gets rejected. It's not just you. It's part of this process, and use whatever feedback. I'm thinking about a few specific ones where we tried to send it out and we got it knocked back. And so we made it better and got it published in JAC or JAE or NACTA. And it did well. And it did well because we used that reviewer feedback to make it stronger.
Yeah, I think that that's all good advice. And I think Courtney's point about, you know, think about the requirements for your institution for promotion and tenure if that's the situation you're in. You know, chasing big journals is always something that we as researchers should aspire to, you know, getting published in a high impact factor journal. But think about, you know, weigh that question of quantity versus quality in terms of publications. And I also think that Taylor's advice of looking at the research that's being published in the outlet that you're trying to publish in, that should be your first thing, the first thing that you do. You know, we had a discussion at NACS about qualitative research and qualitative research within our discipline and within JAC. And one of the most helpful things that I did to even prepare for that discussion was going to another, you know, very applied field that has a qualitative journal and reading some of the material that had been published and that had been downloaded numerous times, and thinking about, okay, well, what can I take from this? What can I take from this discipline? What can I take from this publication? And you know, even apply to my own research. And so just getting a sense of what looks like quality research for this publication, and how can I emulate that, and how can I set up my studies with the goal of that in mind. And I think that that's kind of strategic thinking isn't something that we always do. You know, we really do want to be strategic in how we plan our research and how we execute it and how we publish it. And I think sometimes we're just chasing grants or we're chasing publications, and we don't always think about, well, how actually can I strategize to get, you know, this outcome that I'm searching for? And so that's something that, you know, it's always good to be strategic and to plan and to have that kind of roadmap for your research in place.
I wanted to just add something quickly to what Annie was talking about with like trying to balance submitting to those journals, because they do take a long time. I know Keystone it still isn't published because they won't accept it. But we've been trying for years to get this one paper published. Like, it's just not working. We might kill it at this point because the data is 4 years old and it is what it is. But I got a really good piece of advice from Lisa Lundy, who told me, you know, submit to like our disciplines journals where you know it's going to move faster, you know what they're looking for, you know that process, but you can still have like 3 in those journals and then 1 to maybe an outside journal. So if you are in a place where that is beneficial and that is worth the time, that strategy has seemed to work well, where I still know there's other ones that will go through, but I'm trying to chase this bigger one over here instead of putting all of my articles towards those outside journals where it takes just a lot longer to do. So I thought that was good advice from Lisa that I just wanted to share as well.
I've avoided chiming in, but I will chime in once. For me, the easiest thing is collaborate with people that know those journals and publish in those journals, because they have that incentive to engage with them and they know those norms. And so I've got a data set that it's going to go to other journals, but it's because that other person needs them to go to other journals. And I'm just kind of, I'm the tag along, and I'm okay with that. So my last question is it's gonna piggyback pretty close to what Annie kind of started talking about on the end of her response as well. But before we open up to the just general Q&A from the audience, I just want to hear what y'all's advice for successful papers is. Like, let's put a positive spin on this very negative connotation of a title of a presentation. But whether it's the idea, the execution, writing, revisions, like, what advice would you give these folks to navigate this process successfully.
I'll chime in. As the best thing that authors did for me when I was the editor was a strong letter back to the reviewers in the revise and submit process. That specific, and so the way Jack works, at least, almost all articles that were publishable but not perfect were revise and resubmits, because that allowed them to go back to the reviewer for final checks. If I did a revise or accept with minor revisions, they never got to see it again. So I would often do revise and resubmit, and you're halfway there, more than you're, like that's your green light, or that you can move ahead. And so what the best authors did was they would take the reviewers' comments and write a really strong letter back that said, reviewer one asked me to do this, you'll see this on lines, blah, blah, blah. And then that allowed the reviewers are pointing out things that they care about, that will make your paper stronger. And so if you can acknowledge that, or explain why you didn't change it. Maybe you have an additional citation to add that shows that your way is the better approach or the more accepted approach. Some of us were trained decades ago, and so there may be better approaches now or strategies, or that you acknowledge the limitations. No study is perfect. Every study has limitations, and the best authors were those who were able to say, I acknowledge this, we've added that, you're not trying to hide anything. I mean, you're just laying it out there. So that's one thing I would say. And I tell Dr. Burris still tells us, his advisor in grad school said, get your reviews, go home, don't look at them, get a glass of wine or whatever it is you enjoy, read the reviews while you enjoy your wine, and then the next day start to address them. And so you need a little bit of separation from it. And so that for me is one of the best things you can do as an author, is if you've gotten the revise and resubmit, take that as a very strong encouragement to keep going.
I think that's really great advice, Courtney. And that was kind of what I was going to say. And a lot of that has to do with my experiences more as an advisor of graduate students who are submitting research than for my own experience. I am someone who doesn't handle criticism, even constructive criticism, particularly well. And so I've had to train myself by telling my grad students to not take reviews personally. And it can be really hard not to take, especially negative feedback, in a very personal way, especially if you're talking about research that's really, really near and dear to you. And so, I've gotten a couple papers back recently from grad student publications where I've been the communicating author, if not the lead author. And we've gotten revise and resubmits. We haven't gotten rejections. We've gotten R&Rs. And the first thing that I'll do is look through the feedback that we've been given, and I kind of summarize that and send it off to the grad students. I'm like, hey guys, we've got another chance. Like, this feedback, there's some things that we need to work on, but overall, like, I understand where they're coming from. And so as the corresponding author, it's been kind of a good experience for me to kind of temper my own kind of negative feelings about getting criticism, and kind of demonstrate to my grad students, like, here's how you can take this feedback and take it in the spirit that it's given in, because most reviewers do want to see research improve, and they do want to see a manuscript get better in that second round of reviews. And if you get a revise and resubmit, you have an opportunity to make those changes and to make it better. So yeah, it's one of those, like, do as I say, not as I do sort of things, where I'm like, take this as a positive. We've got another chance. Here are the things that they really liked. Like, focus on what are the things that they praised, and then think about, okay, now what are the things that we can fix? Just kind of changing the mindset with how we handle constructive criticism.
Yes, I have two things. So the first is building off of that comment, and I shared this with the group when we had done like our pre-session meeting for this. I think it's important to also, drink that glass of wine, look at the comments, and distinguish between what is worth addressing and what's worth leaving behind, and figuring out what actually is constructive criticism and what is just an opinion, because sometimes that is there too, and you might have a different opinion and it might be rejected, it might be revised and resubmit, but you can move forward with that. My favorite comment to share with people that I've received was, I think it was for science communication, somebody called me overconfident and ill-informed, and I was like, that is wild, and it just made me laugh. That goes to the wrong person. That's not great though, right? That was not within our discipline, but I was like, okay, some of these comments are valid that they left me. You just kind of have to sort through it. So understanding how to sort through those comments, I think, are really important. For NACS, we don't have the revise and resubmit option. So you kind of have to make sure you get it close to right the first time. What I would suggest doing, and the way I often approach writing, and at least for that methods piece, because it seems to be the biggest holdup for the conference, is try to get ahead of the reviewer questions. Like if you were reviewing this paper, what questions would you have? What gaps would be there? What concerns would you have? Or making sure those limitations are stated and you just get that out of the way. And if you can get ahead of that, that seems to be really helpful. So if you're working with students, for conference submissions, really look at that paper and think about, if I was reviewing this, what holes would be there that I would want to be filled, and try to fill those yourself. And I do want to make just one last comment about NACS, because we did get a couple submissions this year that were research in progress. That's not a category we have in NACS right now. I know that's a category we have in other conferences going on. So I just want to clarify, as of right now, we don't have that for NACS. So like those did get rejected right away too. So for NACS, please make sure you're also submitting completed projects with data to discuss, and not research that's in progress. So I forgot to mention that earlier.
And so at this point, I want to open it up for questions from everybody in attendance.
I'll kick us off. I was trying to find the raise hand, but it was not working for me. So this has been very helpful. Really, really great. Thank y'all for sharing this. As an assistant professor, I'm now in a stage where some of my students have completed a thesis. We're trying to get them into a journal. And some of them I think are really struggling with not just copy pasting, but getting it into a journal format. And I want to know, from a reviewer perspective, what do you look for if you know it's coming from a previously published thesis, possibly a dissertation? Like, how do we train our students to do a good job of keeping it authentic, keeping it quality research, while also not duplicating extra work because they've already done the research? That's where I'm really struggling, and trying to give them advice for a journal of how to reformat and do that well.
So one of the best pieces of advice I got from one of my advisors was, when you are in the process of writing your thesis or your dissertation, at the beginning, at least at Ohio State, at the beginning of every chapter, we have an opportunity to sort of summarize the material that came before. And I tell my students, at some point, you're going to want to get 1, 2, maybe 3 publications out of this. And each of those publications should not read verbatim like every other one. And so if you have these opportunities to kind of summarize or rephrase things as you're writing the document itself, that saves you a little bit of time moving forward, because you've already got slightly differently worded summaries from the beginnings of your chapters. So, chapter 2 starts with a summary of chapter 1, chapter 3 starts with a summary of chapters 1 and 2. And depending on how your institution handles theses and dissertations in terms of formatting and, conventional versus multi-publication, that kind of thing, I think that can be kind of a helpful step to kind of force them to start that rephrasing or that, summarizing process before they even get to the sending to journal stage.
I make my students write a summary of their theoretical framework or conceptual framework in chapter 1. And they often will argue with me until they have to pull it together for a paper. And so these are my master's students. Now, many of our doctoral students are using the 3-paper model. I think Kara's on the call. She did that. Kelsey, you're too long ago. I think you did the traditional dissertation format. So that's one thing I tell them. I'm like, write that summary for chapter 1, because that's all the room you're going to have in a paper. So that way your theoretical framework is pretty much done. I would say that what I've caught, Lacey, I know exactly what you're talking about, is that they start to repeat themselves, because as Annie mentioned, there are parts of each chapter that are repeated. They're rephrasing, they're reminding the reviewer or the reader, but I'm not reading a 100-page document now, right? I'm reading a 20-page document. So they need to recognize areas to be more concise and to eliminate. And it's a hard thing. I know they're like, I spend so much time writing this. I'm like, I know. I'm like, just open up another Word file and put everything there and start deleting it. And it does take, I would say, several passes for them. My final comment, and then I'll let Taylor or others chime in, is the research objectives or questions may be worthy, as Annie said, of dividing into several papers. And so if you kind of can help them, maybe you've already been having that conversation. So I've done mixed method studies, and as good as they are together, they're 2 publications when I pull them apart, and maybe with the page limit, I have room to really describe them. So that's a conversation we have. But yeah, Lacey, I think they need to recognize that, and we all need, once that thesis is submitted, you're not done with the project. Like, there's more work to be done.
So I've not been doing this for nearly as long, but for the few that I have graduated, Lacey, I actually did a 2-article thesis approach. And I think you just have to check with your grad school for what is allowable. So both articles are about the same central topic, similar to like the 3-article dissertation. My chapter 1 was just an introduction to the study and the overall like topic, its significance, overview of both studies. And then chapter 4 brought that data together for that discussion. So like those kind of were the same type of format as a typical thesis. But like for one of my students, we've already gotten both of her articles published, and she just defended last April. So for me, that was a lot quicker because I knew she was going out into industry afterwards. It's like, I don't, kind of like what you're saying, like that'd be so hard to continue that. So I would look into what the rules are with your graduate school, and if that's something you could do. That actually seemed to make it really clear for the students too, because you can also target a journal from the beginning and have them follow those basic guidelines for what might be there. Like AAD was an appropriate outlet for one of those, and they're so specific with how long each section should be for a master's student. That was actually super helpful from the way I had structured that. So that's another option too, is just kind of have it done from the beginning.
So we've got a question in the chat box from Jamie about handling mixed reviews. So we've all had this experience. One reviewer loves it. One reviewer thinks you should have thrown it into a garbage can and shredded it, set it on fire, etc. So how do editors and even for NACs, how do you handle when you get these mixed responses?
So a lot of the policy that I worked with as the executive and managing editor of Jack was based on a lot of hard work that Courtney put into our protocols and guidelines, and you know, so she's sort of the expert on this. But I can share that when I was sort of at the helm, if we had a situation where we had, for example, a reject and an accept, I would typically go to a third reviewer, just because I, at that point, didn't necessarily feel comfortable making the judgment call that it needed to go either way. That felt like a very, you know, as Jamie put it in the question, like that's a really mixed feedback. And it's kind of hard for me as an individual who's seen both of those reviews, right, to make the judgment call about which way to go. So I would typically send that to a third reviewer, and I would instruct the third reviewer that this is a manuscript that had gotten some mixed feedback, and we're really just trying to figure out the direction that we need to take it in. I wouldn't necessarily share specifically what the feedback was, but I would say that we're kind of going to, you know, a third reviewer as sort of a tie break. And if that review came back as either revise and resubmit or accept, then we would go that route. If we got a revise and resubmit, and the third reviewer was sort of meh about it, then we might lean the direction of going the rejection route. So we did try to make sure that papers that got very polarizing feedback at least got a third set of eyes on it. And if we did get like an R&R on that one, I might at that point take a look and say, I think there's more here, and maybe we'll go the revise and resubmit route. So at that point, I would feel comfortable having another sort of external vote, making an editorial decision. But I would not say, yes, we're going to accept it, or no, we're going to reject it based on two polar reviews.
Yep, and thanks, Annie. I agree with that. It's the way we set up that like just procedures. And Jamie, I've gotten those feedback before for conference papers or for journal papers. And the fact is, if it's a revise and resubmit, well, I'm moving forward. Whether that reviewer, and as an editor, I'm trying to remember. I mean, y'all, it's been a minute, so I think there were times that I actually I'd thank a reviewer for their time and not even send the reviews on. Like if they didn't take it, and there's not anyone on this call, but we know who we shouldn't be going back to review, or we know who we could rely on. The other point, like when I'm addressing reviewers' comments, I remember writing once, like reviewer 2 had very minimal feedback for me. And then I had like 2 pages of things to address reviewer 1. And it's just a matter of, who's reviewing it at that point in time and what they like to focus in on. And so sometimes we get lucky and we have one who really liked it and one that wanted a lot of revisions. And I just tried to address what I could and acknowledge that the other reviewer did not have any comments on this point. So that's within our journal. Jamie, I hope that helps. We can't solve all of the journals' mixed reviews.
And I think we've got time for one more question before we need to do just kind of the general update for the webinar. Anybody have a last question they want to ask?
I do. Hi, everyone. Whenever I get a revise and resubmit, I'm always like, yes, this is a good sign. But I've been a reviewer on some papers where my first decision is revise and resubmit. And then the second time I look at it, I'm like, no, this isn't good enough revisions. So I think partly as a reviewer, I want to hear from the editors, like, is that okay? It seems like it should be okay, but I just want to make sure. And then 2, like, what are your thoughts in that process from a reviewer standpoint and then an author standpoint? Because it's got to be confusing for the author. What are your thoughts?
I think it's important that authors know that revise and resubmit it is a green light to move forward. It is not a guarantee that it's eventually going to be accepted. And one of the things that I saw as an editor was there were some reviewers who were almost too nice in these situations where they were like, okay, the manuscript needs work, but I think the research has merit. Let's do an R&R and see what happens on the second pass. And I had a couple of reviewers who, if the revisions were not enough to get it over that hump, instead of saying reject it, they would be like, let's do another round of revisions. And as an editor, that is your nightmare, because you're just like, no, please do not let this languish any longer. I think that we need reviewers to also feel empowered to say, this was not what I was expecting from this round of revisions. And I at this stage, I don't think it's ready to go. Because usually the worst that happens is they have an opportunity to resubmit it as a research and brief if they're going to JAC, or they have an opportunity to take it elsewhere. So that's one thing that I kind of had to start like sharing with the reviewers who were receiving revisions back. I would just be like, if you don't think this thing has legs, just kill it. Just don't have mercy on it by just saying, let's stop, because you can go into round after round of revisions and it takes forever and no one is usually happy with the outcome. The authors don't like that they've had to make changes. The reviewers hate seeing the same thing over and over again, even though they asked to see it again. And so at that point, I think it's just more merciful to say, I don't think that this is going to be up to scratch at that point. So yeah, so don't be afraid to just say, this isn't what I was expecting. I don't think there's a there. Because I think we try to be nice to each other, and sometimes we need to maybe be less nice.
Yeah, and Katie, I would say absolutely you should, and nothing makes me more angry as a reviewer than people not taking the time to address the comments. And I spend a lot of time on my reviews. If the paper has merit and I want to give it some, I treat it like I'm treating a grad student's paper. Like with these revisions, this would be a really strong. And if they can't address those revisions or argue back why they don't need to, and if they do, I'll be like, valid, okay, fine. And sometimes when they fix thing in one area, then it makes sense later. But we at Jack, we do not engage in a lengthy review process. This paper is now rejected. That's the line. Yeah, and Taylor, I'm reading your comment. I think as the editor, there's a point when we just have to step in and make a judgment call.
Yeah, and they ended up sending it to a third reviewer who had like minimal comments. So I think it'll get through. But yeah, I would agree. I think sometimes as reviewers, we have to look at it like, are these things that can actually be revised or not? And one of the other things we had talked about in our planning meeting too, as a reviewer, if you get a paper that's like not your area, not your method expertise, like I think it's better to say like, either like I can't do this, or if it's close enough where you can read into it and like learn about it and review it, rather than just winging it. Because I've had some of my stuff rejected or asked for revisions that was not incorrect. It was just, statistical methods people hadn't seen before. As a grad student though, I also had stuff accepted that was a mess because people didn't know how to do a logistic regression, and I didn't either. And then I learned, I was like, this is wildly wrong. So I think it's really important as reviewers that we're actually reviewing content we understand. And if it's way outside of our wheelhouse, I would imagine as editors, you would rather know that than me just be like, I think this is how you do a Q sort. I have no idea how to do a Q sort. So like, I probably shouldn't review those types of studies. So I think that's important too.
And one of the things I think that you as authors and reviewers can do to help editors is, if you have an opportunity to fill out a reviewer or an author profile that lists your areas of expertise, that makes our lives so much easier, because then, we're familiar with a lot of each other's work just because we are a small discipline. But, you might be gaining knowledge in, like Taylor said, a methodology that not everybody has expertise in. And if that's not reflected in your reviewer information, we don't necessarily know that. And so letting us know that there are specific things that you feel qualified to review, letting us know when there are things that you don't feel qualified to review. Those are the kinds of things that as editors, that information is invaluable when we go to assign reviewers, because it sometimes feels like we just assume that it's whoever hasn't reviewed for a while, but we do put effort into making sure that those papers go to someone who can provide quality feedback. And the more information we have about our authors and reviewers, the better able we are to do that.
All right. Well, thank y'all very much for letting the panelists talk to y'all today.
Thank you very much, Keisto, for organizing our panelists. So let's everyone give our panel and our panelist coordinator a very happy thank you very much for your time today. I know that I learned a lot. Hopefully my papers, my manuscripts will be accepted. And if not, I will be happy to add more comments in the chat, gulp, oof, and any other words like that. As I kept seeing these pop up in the chat, I was reminded of the old Batman TV show, Bam, Boof, Biff, and that type of thing. It's like I'm just ready for somebody just pop Taylor right there, just on the jaw with her 4th revision of this. So, are there any announcements people might have, or anything they'd like to share with the group? Anything at all?
I can give a general update on some assistantships at OSU.
Sure.
Obviously, that we have gobs of assistantships at OSU. So if you have students that are interested in coming here, and not just interested in coming here, we're going to get a brand new ag hall with a brand new Mac lab. So it's going to be a fun, spiffy new building. So the one thing I'll kind of plug for our assistantships, we have the traditional ones that are in the department. But if you've got students who want to go to grad school but still want to get traditional work experience along the way, folks across the campus enjoy our students working for them. So my favorite one though is we have a pet therapy program called Pete's Pet Posse, where employees are able to bring their dogs on campus, and they want to hire an ag comm student to continue doing their communications. And frankly, that is the best assistantship. If it paid anywhere near what I make now, I might do it myself.
All right, so if we don't see Keystone next month, we'll know what happened. He's now doing communication for a dog something or other. All right, great. Anything else? I was not expecting that. That's all right. If not, seeing some comments there in the chat. Shameless plug for people who might want to be JAC editors in the future, and I know that's also true for other journals that we have within the discipline broadly defined. So always look for that. And I would also say for those who've served as editor and may serve as editor, reviewers. If you're not a reviewer on this call and would like to be one, please reach out to the current journal editor, because they need reviewers. And when there's a request for conference papers and posters reviewers, please consider doing that as well. Next month, March 25th, we have Amanda Ruth McSwain, who will be talking about establishing and leveraging industry connections in the classroom and beyond. So that'll be same time a month from now, and then we have one more session after that in April, and then we'll be off for the academic year. I just mention that because if you are kind of tootling in your mind about maybe a topic that you would like to do for next year, please be thinking about that. I'll have a call for webinar ideas, proposals coming up probably the next few weeks or so. With that, thank you all very much for being here and have a great day.